I'm Charles Powell, and this is Religion in 60 Minutes. Today's topic, Russia in Ukraine. What's religion got to do with it? Today's talk is sponsored by the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion and co-sponsored by the Nanovic Institute for European Studies and by the Catholic Peacebuilding Network and the University of Notre Dame's World Religions, World Church program. The Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion is dedicated to studying, learning from, and collaborating with religious communities worldwide for the common good. Its wide-ranging work includes research, teaching, outreach, and interaction with religious communities, faith and civic leaders, academics and journalists, and the general public. Together, these efforts enable the Institute to foster deliberation, offer training, implement transformative educational programs, and generate ideas on how religion can continue to serve as a force for good in the world. Learn more at ansari.nd.edu. I'm joined today by Jose Casanova, Professor Emeritus at Georgetown University, Robert Cruz, Professor of History at Stanford University, Annemarie Reilly, Executive Director and Vice President for Strategy, Technology, and Communication at Catholic Relief Services, and Pavlo Smytsnyuk, Director of the Institute for Ecumenical Studies at Ukrainian Catholic University. Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly invoked religion in an effort to justify the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Several questions will be explored. Some examples include, how specifically has Putin used religion, and in particular, Russian Orthodox Christianity in his rhetoric? To what extent has it helped him build support for the war? How do such actions fit into a larger global context where political leaders at times seek to instrumentalize religion for ostensibly secular ends? And how is religion helping to address the human cost of the war as religious NGOs provide assistance for Ukrainian refugees? Professor Jose Casanova, welcome to the conversation. Professor Jose, if you could unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm sorry. Thank you so much for having me here. As it was said, I'm a sociologist of religion who has been studying comparative religions and secular dynamics for many, many years. And I happen to have a special interest in Ukraine. So I've been studying religious dynamics in Ukraine also for 30 years. And very clearly, I saw there was a unique pattern there of religious pluralism, unique to Europe and much more akin to American denominationalism. So we can talk about it and what it has to do with the war.
And we certainly will. Professor Robert Cruz, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. My name is Robert Cruz. I teach at Stanford, where I focus my research and teaching primarily on modern Afghanistan, Russia, and the study of global Islam. Back in the day, I wrote a book on Islam and the Russian Empire, which will be my focus later today.
Executive Director Annemarie Reilly, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Charles. It's good to be here with you. My name is Annemarie Reilly. I work for Catholic Relief Services. I am the Executive Vice President for Strategy, Technology, and Communications, as well as Chief of Staff. I've worked for CRS for over 30 years in many different countries, but since 2006, I've been based in our global headquarters in Baltimore, Maryland.
And Director Pavlo Smytsnyuk, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you, Charles. I'm Director of Institute of Ecumenical Studies, which is part of Ukrainian Catholic University in Lviv, Western Ukraine. I work on religion and nationalism. In the past, I worked on Greek Orthodox nationalism and Hindu nationalism. Since I was back to Ukraine several years ago, I started to work more in depth on Russian religious nationalism and Ukrainian religious nationalism, I will be happy to share my thoughts with you. Thank you.
And Director Smytsnyuk, where are you at this very moment? Are you in Ukraine or are you in the United States?
I'm in New York. I came here before the war has started to prepare my thesis for publication, and I remained here for now. But every morning I spend being in touch with my team in Ukraine. We are keeping running the institution. The university is going on. So at least COVID has taught us how to work at a distance and work online. In this sense, it was a blessing for our institutions.
Brilliant. Thank you all for being with us today. I will ask you each a question. You will have 10 minutes to respond and then 2 minutes between each question to conversate. Towards the end of the program, you will have a few minutes to share any additional thoughts, and we will take questions from the audience. I'd like to begin this session with Professor Casanova. Professor, you are one of the world's top scholars in the sociology of religion. Ukraine is a place where people of many faith traditions gather to worship. A large percentage of Ukrainians belong to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. This Sunday, April 24th, the Eastern Orthodox Church will celebrate Easter. I'm sure both sides, Ukraine and Russia, would like to celebrate a large victory. Please take a few moments and speak to the religious forces at work in Ukraine. Prior to the war, what did religious freedom look like, and what would it look like under Russian Orthodoxy? Moreover, what, if any, power does the Church have to end this war in Ukraine? Professor Casanova.
Okay, thank you. We need to go back to the beginning of independence, or actually before, when Glasnost arrived very late in Ukraine in 1989. At the time, there was only one official church in Soviet Ukraine, and this was the Russian Orthodox Church. But very soon, people, especially in the Western Oblast of Ukraine, that are the last ones to be incorporated into Soviet Ukraine after World War II, they began trying to take back what had been their churches, historical churches, the Greek Catholic Church, and then Ukrainian Orthodox that wanted to go back to, some of them, to their old historical autocephalous church. But then the new church, Ukrainian Orthodox KU Patriarchate, had split from the Russian Orthodox Church. And so you had very soon three competing Orthodox churches, the autocephalous, the KU Patriarchate, and the Moscow Patriarchate. And then you have the Greek Catholics that were predominant, the largest numbers in the Western Oblast of Halechina, Galicia. And a new dynamic started. When you have four national churches claiming to be the church, then they become denominations, as happened in the United States. And the other religious minorities become also denominations. So the dynamic of church sect, a national church and religious minorities, which is the pattern throughout Europe, or two national churches, simply gave way to a new denominational pattern. The majority of Ukrainians, indeed, over 70% are Orthodox, but many of them are still undecided as to with which of the churches to affiliate. The Moscow Patriarchate reacted to these, claiming we are the only really, let's say, legitimate church in Ukraine. All the others are either schismatics or heretics, the Protestants, or uniatists, the Greek Catholics, and they have no right to be in Ukraine. But of course, there was a secular state that did not protect any particular church or did not establish any particular church, but protect religious freedom. And so you have these, not only the growth of all kinds of religious communities working together, living together, but also a unique pattern of collaboration, which is represented by the fact that all the churches and religious communities of Ukraine are together in this unique association, organization called the All Ukrainian Council of Religious Churches and Organizations. About 15 of the main churches, religious communities belong to this council. The three Orthodox churches, the Greek Catholics, the Roman Catholics, about 4 or 5 different groups of Protestants, Lutherans, Anglicans, Pentecostals, evangelical, Baptists, and then the Jewish and the Muslim communities. And the quality of all those religions is signified by the fact that the chairmanship of the association rotates every 6 months equally among all the religious organizations. So let's say a year ago, it was the Jewish community that chaired the council. And so they decided to go all of them together to Jerusalem and have their meeting, their 6-monthly meeting in Jerusalem for all of them, called Christian, Jews, and Muslims. It is the Holy Land, it's a sacred land. So this is a symbol. And all of them were together at Maidan, together, praying together, having the funerals together for all the victims that were precisely killed by the repression of the authorities. And throughout the process, even today, they work together with the government, but not in sense of lobbying individually for their interests, but lobbying together for any kind of legislative purposes, for whatever they think is the common good for Ukrainian society, the kind of common moral values that they should uphold, that legislation should uphold. This means that before they even go to the government, they need a process of consensual deliberation among all the Christians, all the Muslims, the Jews, precisely to come with a message to the secular authorities. So it's a unique structure. And of course, it was very clear, symbolically represented when the Ecumenical Patriarch, because one of the churches, I mean, the 3 Orthodox churches, were reunited with the Tomos of Autocephaly that was given by the Ecumenical Patriarch, bringing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in communion with global Orthodoxy. But the Moscow Patriarchate did not want to unite. Only 2 bishops unite, and a lot of parishes, a lot of lay theologians and lay Orthodox leaders united, but many stay with Moscow. Today, we see the process in the midst of war that more and more communities are also leaving the Moscow Patriarchate to create an autonomous structure not yet associated with the Ecumenical Patriarch. Last year, in August, the celebration of Ukrainian independence, the Ecumenical Patriarch visited Ukraine, and in front of Hagia Sophia, the historical church of Kiev Rus, there you have the Patriarch, and his left is the head of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Metropolitan Epiphany, and his right, the head of the Greek Catholic Church, Metropolitan Sviatoslav, then the Roman Catholic Cardinal, and all kinds of Protestant ministers, all of them not in religious clothes, but dressed in secular clothes, as Protestant ministers do, and Jewish leaders and Muslim leaders. The only exception was the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, that claims to be the only official church in Ukraine and doesn't work along with the others. All the other religious groups work together rather well and consensually. And even today, in the midst of war, all of them basically have asked for the end of the war and have asked for helping the civilians, shielding the civilians, offering humanitarian services and protection to the civilians. What will happen if the occupation lasts under occupied territories? We know what happened in Crimea after annexation and what happened in Donbass. Basically, those who did not accept the hegemony of the Moscow Patriarchate, or that were simply suspect, like Greek Catholics, Ukrainian Orthodox, or Protestant ministers, had either to leave, or if not, basically they were repressed. Many of them were in prison. Some of them were killed in Luhansk and Donetsk. And the same happened with Jehovah's Witnesses, happened with Protestant ministers, with Orthodox priests. And so this is something that is very clear in terms of the majority of churches that have been destroyed through the war are actually Ukrainian Orthodox churches. Many of them were part of the Moscow Patriarchate, but it was part of the totally uncontrolled bombing of civilian monuments and buildings, including, of course, churches. So this is the situation. Could religious authorities do something? Well, the only one that could do it will be Kirill of Moscow, the Patriarch. But of course, so far he has been actually sacralizing the war, deciding that this is just war against Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't want to be part of Kiev Rus. So if you are not one of us, then we need to destroy you. We need to denazify you. Or in addition to that, this war is a war against the decadent West. So these two aspects of the war, the one is specifically anti-Ukrainian, the other is specifically anti-Western, anti-liberal, anti-European, as part of the culture wars. So those are the two moments. This have been going on, these conflicts, the war since 2014, the conflict for at least, I would say, almost 2 decades, but people were not expecting so much that these culture wars will become weaponized to such an extent.
Yeah, you know, the question comes up, is this Christianity versus Christianity? Some say absolutely not, and I've heard some say that it is. Patriarch Kirill depicted the war in starkly spiritual terms recently. He said, and I quote, "We have entered into a struggle that has not a physical, but a metaphysical significance," end quote. He has portrayed the war as a struggle for, quote, "for eternal salvation," end quote, for ethnic Russians. The ecumenical Orthodox Patriarch of Constantinople, Bartholomew I, openly condemned the war in an interview with Turkish media, saying, quote, "The whole world is against Russia," end quote. And then in front of a crowd at St. Peter's Square in the Vatican, Pope Francis pleaded, quote, "In the name of God, I ask you, stop this massacre," end quote, calling the invasion an act of, quote, "unacceptable armed aggression," end quote. And I wonder, does this war backfire on Russian expansion? Does it diminish in some way the Russian Orthodox Church?
Well, unfortunately, the very resistance to their claims, they view it as precisely the symbol of evil against their good, holy war. This is something which, of course, Ukrainians have been experiencing for a long time. They always, in all the forums of ecumenical forums, they've never allowed the so-called uniates, the Greek Catholics that on the one hand are loyal to Rome, on the other hand, they have a Eastern ritual, Byzantine ritual and tradition. So they are, and they claim that that once upon a time when Kiev and Rus started, of course, was before the schism between Rome and Constantinople. So they are and want to be in communion with both, with Constantinople and Rome. Here, the problem is, of course, Moscow does not accept even this possibility. The same way that does not accept the possibility of a Ukrainian Orthodox Church in communion with both, with the Ecumenical Patriarch and with it, with global Orthodoxy. So yes, this is also a conflict, a very serious conflict between the two major patriarchates in global Orthodoxy, the Moscow Patriarchate and the Constantinople. And this has been going on again since 2014, when the Holy Synod of the Holy Orthodox Church was organized and was convoked in Crete in 2016. The Moscow Patriarchate, along with some other Orthodox churches, the Patriarch of Antioch in Syria and the Serbian Church, boycotted the council. And today, of course, we have this conflict between the two churches, the two part of global Orthodoxy being basically play out throughout the diasporas of Orthodoxy in Africa. Today, there's a very clear conflict between the Moscow Patriarchate and the Patriarchate of Alexandria, that until now had the jurisdiction of all African Eastern churches. But now Russia is clearly trying to get these churches away from Alexandria and to be part of the Moscow Patriarchate. So yeah, it's a geopolitical conflict with the Moscow Patriarchate plays along with the typical Putin regime geopolitical conflict.
Thank you. Professor Smytsnyuk, Professor Cruz, Annemarie Reilly, any other comments you'd like to make to what has been said? If not, we'll go on to the next question that I have for you. And this question is for Professor Robert Cruz. I was reading an article the other day in the Washington Post titled, "Muslims are fighting on both sides in Ukraine." After I read the article, I looked to see who wrote it, and lo and behold, it was you. So what is going on? Can you speak to the role of Islam in this war?
Sure. Thank you very much again for having me. I have a few images here. The geography and personalities may be somewhat unfamiliar to all of us. So I have a few images for us. If I may, again, thank you for having me. Islam is playing an enormous role. It is in some ways, the Kremlin is looking to the Muslim communities of Russia to play the role of kind of junior partner in constructing specifically religious arguments to mobilize the Muslim population of Russia, which numbers some 20 million. There's no solid set of data to share, unfortunately, but we're looking at anywhere between 15 and 18% of the total population. In some areas, they form a majority. I'll show some images in a moment. But they're also prominent, say, in Moscow and St. Petersburg, where there is a large migrant labor population from the Caucasus and Central Asia. So really, Muslims are quite well integrated throughout Russian life. And the Kremlin recognizes that it's very important to attempt to pursue a parallel track to mobilize this set of communities alongside the Orthodox Church that Professor Casanova outlined for us so elegantly. And I highlight really three audiences in imagining how the Kremlin thinks of its Muslim constituencies, its audiences for these specifically religious arguments in favor of this brutal war that it's waging in Ukraine. First, there's the national audience of Muslims of dozens of different ethnicities across the Russian Federation. A second audience really is the Russian military itself, which is multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. And you may have been following in that article or elsewhere that, in fact, we know not enough about the casualties that the Russian military is suffering in Ukraine, but it's clear that Muslims are well represented. We know that from the names and the fact that as the Kremlin has delegated responsibility to local elites to divulge military losses, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, some jurisdictions with Muslim majority populations have taken it on themselves to divulge the identities of those injured, especially killed in the war. And there have been burials, there have been media coverage. And so it's hard to say that they're overrepresented, but if we think about the economy of the Russian military and of conscripts and so-called contract soldiers, these tend to be drawn from people from smaller towns, lower incomes, lower educational backgrounds, fewer opportunities, and those tend to map onto areas, especially in the North Caucasus. So Dagestan appears to be one of the sources of Russian military conscription and recruitment. And then Chechnya, of course, it plays an enormous role, as we'll see in a moment. Another key area to think about is the Volga and Ural Mountains regions, where Tatarstan and Bashkortostan are very key Muslim majority regions with a lot of political weight. And really, this is where many of the most important Muslim clerics either are located or hail from and are now in the capitals. So if we think institutionally for a moment about the structure of Russian Islam, there are dozens of Muslim clerics who have some kind of official state backing. And the Kremlin has long been very careful to make sure that there's centralization, but not a clear preference for a single leader. So you have, in fact, multiple dueling hierarchies, that is rival hierarchies, some of which have a national basis, some of which are regionally based. This image here portrays one figure who's celebrating himself as the head of all Russian Muslims for 41 years. This is actually contested, of course. And I would say that as an initial caveat for everything I'll say is that there's no single understanding of what is Russian Islam. There are multiple competing leaders. There are multiple competing strands. And we'll see that, in fact, the Kremlin's attempt to mobilize this community has met with mixed results. I wish I could say more about the actual success or failure. It's a mixed picture, and I think it's too early to say. But first, I can outline just what some of the arguments are, what they look like for making this a kind of struggle that all Russian Muslims should care about as a religious duty. And of course, this is heightened by the coincidence of the war with Ramadan. The real face, I mentioned all these different clerical figures, but the face of the war for many Russians has become this figure, Ramzan Kadyrov, who was the strongman of Chechnya. He himself is not a cleric, but he has been one of the most important figures in attempting to construct religious arguments for the war. He is the son of a cleric, the son of a mufti, who in 2000 became the Kremlin's man on the ground in Chechnya during the so-called Second Russian-Chechen War, which occurred from 1999 until 2009. So the Kadyrov family has been extremely important for the Russian conquest of Chechnya, for its domestication But this figure, Ramzan Kadyrov, is really his infamy, his fame has grown with the war. And I think he's, many Russian scholars note that he is the only regional politician who actually has kind of a national standing in Russia itself, that he's known to a broader Russian public outside of his region. Within the region, many of you already know that he's famous for human rights abuses, for especially anti-gay violence. But here he's played an absolutely crucial role in Chechnya, because he and his own kind of personal militia have been mobilized in the war, using the reputation of a stereotype of Chechens as being particularly ferocious fighters, particularly ruthless, particularly effective, particularly bloodthirsty. And there was a clear attempt early in the war to use these Chechen fighters as a kind of force of intimidation against Ukrainian resistance. And they have a very sophisticated media campaign. Kadyrov himself has not gone to Ukraine, but he has given this his blessing. He sent his closest kind of commanders there. And the Russian media have made a great kind of show of the Kadyrov battalions fighting on behalf of Russia as an exemplar of Russia's multinational, multi-religious status. At the same time, Kadyrov has made it clear that his right-hand man, the senior cleric in Chechnya, has given his blessing for this war as jihad. And so this is, again, not a universal stance, but other clerics have offered fatwas claiming that this is in conformity with Islamic law. And the arguments are varied, but this recalls Professor Casanova's reflections on the church. The arguments here are varied. One is that Ukraine is, of course, made up of Nazis, right? So this is an anti-Nazi struggle. And in Islam, Nazism is a sin. So that's one common argument. But it ranges. It ranges to, this is a patriotic duty. And as Russian citizens, we must serve, our patriotic duty. And there are broader arguments about the ways in which, the West has essentially colonized Ukraine and is imposing its values, which are debauched, which are immoral, which are pro-LGBTQ, and they use that acronym. And then, in fact, this is a kind of spiritual battle of good versus evil, in which Muslims can't be on the sidelines. So this is very much an attempt to delegitimize Ukrainian statehood, but also it's clearly a proxy war. This is the West. The West is at our door. The West is going to infect us with non-traditional values. And so if we go back to this image, this whole alliance of, and there are other images here from the same conference that occurred in Ufa a few days ago. There is a rabbi, I think there are other Christian leaders, but this idea that Russia has, yes, the Orthodox are front and center, they're number one, but Russia is home to so-called traditional values. And Islam represents one of the foundations of Russia's traditional values. So it's a kind of cosmopolitanism, a kind of multiculturalism, but rooted in the claim that Russia is essentially traditional. Islam's traditional, Buddhism is traditional, Judaism is traditional, and what's happening in Ukraine is a Trojan horse for the West and their debauched values. Now, there is enormous pushback. Oh, I'm sorry, let me add another feature of this, is that the third audience I mentioned is international. And this is where I think, we have less to go on, but it's noteworthy that Russia has drawn upon its recent activities in the Middle East and North Africa to draw upon reserves of Syrian and Libyan mercenaries. A new report as of yesterday claims that there may be as many as 20,000 fighting for Russia and Ukraine. And in fact, this war, as Charles Powell noted before, pits Muslims against Muslims, right? So here we see an image of the Muslim communities in Ukraine itself, which are quite extensive. And if you followed in 2014, Russia's seizure of Crimea, that this was followed by Russian reprisals against the Crimean Tatar community, who have a long history of facing state repression in the Russian Empire, in the Soviet Union, and then at the hands of the Russian Federation. So we now have a kind of war of words in which Ukrainian clerics are challenging Russia's Muslims to defy Putin, to defy the religious arguments in the name of Islam for this war. And we see articles about Crimean Tatars joining in the Ukrainian army, fasting during Ramadan, but also enduring, making this a spiritual and national struggle on behalf of Crimean Tatars and on behalf of Ukraine. We have an exiled mufti from Crimea trying to engage in a dialogue with Russian Muslims, and asking them on religious grounds to condemn the so-called special operation in Ukraine. And perhaps most importantly, this figure, Said Ismailov, has emerged as a kind of Ukrainian patriot who has actually recently, I think, joined the armed forces, and has really been a quite eloquent voice in trying to communicate to Russia's Muslims in the North Caucasus, especially in Tatarstan and Bashkortostan, and to the senior leaders to reject this as an Islamic duty and to look instead to the idea of Islamic solidarity against Putin's aggression. Now, there's another set of actors, which is quite interesting too, which is really made up of a loose conglomerate of exiles from primarily the first Russo-Chechen War and subsequent police operations in Dagestan and elsewhere in the North Caucasus aimed against so-called Salafis, that is, those who reject the officially backed authorities, the Russian-backed authorities, state-backed authorities in the North Caucasus, and instead argue that, in fact, like this figure does, Sheikh Abdullah Kostyevsky, that no Muslims should fight for either army. He has a very expansive Instagram, YouTube presence. He, I think, is in exile in Turkey now. And he actually has a very interesting Russian-speaking audience across Russia. And his argument is fundamentally that Russia is an anti-Islamic state, and that no Muslim should serve in the Russian armed forces. At the same time, he argues, this is not a war for any Muslim. So he actually discourages Ukrainians from participating in this war as well. But there's a vast spectrum, actually, of actors who represent elements of this diaspora, some of whom have gone from Chechnya to Ukraine itself to fight on the Ukrainian side. So Chechens are actually really at the front lines on both sides. And you have international fighters from everywhere. And so this is truly a conflict that has great potential to expand into the Middle East and North Africa. And I'll conclude with just a broader observation, an attempt to assess where this is going. Within Russia itself, it's not clear that there are major fissures opening up in the Muslim community. But the North Caucasus is a place to watch because there is already an underground opposition. There has been kind of fertile ground for Islamic State recruitment to the Middle East. Thousands of people have left the Caucasus to fight there. And there are regular prosecutions that are ongoing. And this underground Salafi movement can potentially gain strength by opposing Russian military operations. So it's very, very complicated. So these are arguments against Ukrainian war that aren't necessarily rooted in liberalism or secularism, but are rooted in conceptions of Islamic statehood and justice. Internationally, I think it's quite fascinating. I'm not suggesting that there's a kind of Islamic underpinning to this, but it's quite notable if one looks at a recent vote about whether or not Russia should be suspended from the United Nations Human Rights Council. There were lots of votes against, 24, but the abstentions are really interesting because they include the largest Muslim countries. So you have Indonesia, India, Pakistan, Egypt. We go down the list to Iraq, and on. Many states in North Africa, including Pakistan, India, Indonesia. I know that the big three, and then Saudi Arabia, all abstained. So there are multiple geopolitical reasons for their abstention, but I think the religious element allows the idea that Russia's Muslim clerics are on the side of the war, largely, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. I think that argument has helped give some political cover to places like Indonesia, where Muslims may ask, why are you supporting this Putin government, right? So I think there are actually global implications that have not yet been recognized internationally that in fact these religious arguments are playing to at least three audiences simultaneously. But let me pause there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for unpacking this for us. I wonder, before I ask any questions or make any more comments, anybody on the panel want to say anything? I do want to raise a question, and I think, Professor Cruz, you might be able to answer this for us. Monsignor John Myler raises the question, can you speak to Putin's religious background?
I'm not sure I'm the best qualified to do this. I think he's in his own kind of portrayal of himself, he's always claimed a kind of innate affinity for Orthodoxy, even if he was raised in a largely secular home. I think he claimed he was secretly baptized. I think it's part of his core, and certainly his public persona is very much about deep devotion to Orthodox Christian tradition. But from my point of view, I would highlight that this is only one aspect of what Putin is. Putin is also someone who is very careful on every Muslim holiday to issue a note of congratulation to the Muslim community of the Russian Federation, right? So he has an ecumenical strand, which, to my mind, is something that all great imperial leaders have done, right? I mean, he recognizes that this is a complex, multi-ethnic, multinational society that he must keep together, right? And so there is interestingly for your audience, there is actually a very extensive space in Russia for all kinds of interconfessional dialogue. And the Orthodox Church is always center, right? It's always placed slightly above the others, but there is great effort to finding common ground and recognizing that this is a necessary foundation of the maintenance of inter-ethnic and interreligious peace in Russia. And yet it's always hierarchical, right? It's always it's never a question, who was first among supposed equals, right? But strikingly, Muslim leaders do go along with this, and they are also dependent upon the Russian state for patronage and for their authority in their contests with one another. So, like the rest of Russian society, one looks up to the center, and I think but what's fascinating is that the Russian state, labors at this. It isn't that it just assigns this role willy-nilly. It actively maintains or attempts to actively maintain the allegiances of its Muslim citizens. So I think it's a kind of ecumenicism, right, that is authoritarian and hierarchical. But and I think that is very much a lesson from Russia's imperial past, that it recognizes that these relations must be constantly managed and maintained, and that religion is actually all religions that are recognized as being traditional are essential to the functioning of the Russian state.
And if we have time, I'd like to come back to this idea that you shared with us, Islamic solidarity. But for now, let's move on to Annemarie Reilly. Annemarie, thank you for joining us today. Catholic Relief Services humanitarian work is on the ground, I understand, in Ukraine. The images and the sounds originating in war-torn Ukraine that we are bombarded with every day is horrific. The CRS website reads, and I quote, "Your help is needed in Ukraine, where there is great risk of suffering, both within Ukraine and for those who may flee to neighboring countries for safety. CRS and our partners are responding, and we need immediate support to meet both ongoing needs as well as those related to families forced to flee their homes as the situation intensifies. Moreover, CRS and partners are ready to provide safe shelter, hot meals, hygiene supplies, fuel to keep warm, transport to safe areas, counseling support, and more," end quote. God have mercy. How is this being carried out on the ground? How are religious communities uniting and supporting these humanitarian efforts? If you will, Annemarie, set the scene for us.
Sure. Thank you, Charles. I think most people know that in Ukraine today, in a country of 44 million people, a quarter of the population are on the move. So approximately 5 million people have left the country and fled to neighboring countries and beyond. About 7.1 million people are internally displaced. That is massive in terms of the amount of population movement and the obvious humanitarian needs that come along with that. That's not to mention, of course, what we all know in terms of what we've seen and in terms of the destruction of infrastructure, residences, hospitals, other kinds of destruction that has taken place. And what we're seeing right now in the movement of troops to the eastern part of the country, we know what has happened to date in that part of the country, and it's quite frightening to imagine what is going on right now and what will result in the current focus of the Russian forces in that part of the country. Catholic Relief Services has been around for 8 decades. We work in a variety of areas, including humanitarian response. Clearly, we also do a lot of work in development, but I'll focus on the humanitarian response work. And we're part of an international network called Caritas Internationalis. This is a Roman Catholic network of social service organizations around the world. There are about 165 members. There are 2 Caritas members in Ukraine. There's Caritas Ukraine, which is representing the Greek Orthodox community, and Caritas Spes Ukraine, which represents the Roman Catholic community. They are both members of the Caritas Internationalis Confederation and coordinate and work closely together with each other, as well as with Caritas organizations from around the world. So first and foremost, I want to say that they are present in the country and they are supported by their sister organizations such as Catholic Relief Services and others from around the world in terms of mobilizing resources to support their response and provide them with technical support as well. And there are Caritas agencies or organizations in all of the surrounding countries. So Caritas Poland, Hungary, Romania, Moldova, other countries have all also mobilized to provide support to incoming refugees. And my organization provides a lot of technical assistance, capacity strengthening, other kinds of support. We had a team that went into Ukraine before the violence began in anticipation of the worst case scenario that occurred, to work with our local partners to help them to prepare to the extent that they could, and continue to go in and work in partnership and solidarity with Caritas Ukraine and Caritas Spes. We have colleagues who were most recently in Lviv helping to support them there. So the humanitarian needs are enormous and ongoing. And we also know that these needs will only continue to grow, as well as in a post-conflict environment. I think we can all easily imagine the ongoing needs that will be present in terms of reconstruction and support. So I will say that CRS has received tremendous support from the Catholic community in the United States and others, as well as US government and other institutional donor support to be able to launch very large-scale humanitarian response. To date, within Ukraine, Caritas Ukraine and Caritas Spes have supported close to 800,000 people with humanitarian need support. And in all of, again, these surrounding countries, everything from meeting people at the border and helping to direct them to where they need to go for support, as well as meeting immediate needs at the moment, to providing housing support, cash assistance, other kinds of support for people to be able to survive where they have landed is ongoing. I am not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on the religious aspects of this conflict, and I'm just fascinated by what I'm learning today by my fellow panelists. I will say that the Caritas network obviously does what we do because we are Catholic, because it is who we are, because faith is, our faith and Catholic teaching call us to do this work. But we are very clear that it is, our response is based on need, not creed, and there is no, we serve whoever is in need at the moment. And I don't really know how any of this is playing out in terms of the religious aspects of this conflict on the ground. I do know that what I hear from our Caritas partners, of course, is one of a focus on just the human needs and protecting human life and dignity. That's what our mission is about, and that's what we strive to achieve. I could go on about a lot of details of exactly what we're doing, but I'll leave it there. If there's any additional follow-up that's needed, I'm happy to offer more in terms of some of the specifics. But I would say that overall, it is clearly a humanitarian crisis of enormous proportions, and not only today, but we know that this is going to have a long-term effect for many years to come in terms of the massive destruction that has occurred. It is also been, though, I think, an experience that we've had in which the solidarity and the outpouring of support has also been tremendous. Of course, I have to say, I know we're focused on Ukraine, but we wish in some respects that this kind of attention could go to other places such as Yemen and Ethiopia and other places that are suffering terribly as well. But I will say that the outpouring of support for our response in Ukraine, that of our Caritas partners in the country as well as in the surrounding countries, has been quite generous. I'll say one more thing, and that's just to say that I think what's so important to note in terms of these organizations is that they are part of the community. They're not just flying in from outside. They are Ukrainians, they are Poles, they are Romanians, et cetera, who are offering this support to others. And not only have they been there before the conflict, they're there now, but they will remain after as members of their communities. And I think the incredible stories that we hear of members of the Caritas community, not only those that work for the Caritas organizations, but their volunteer networks, the heroics that we have seen in terms of people really putting their lives in danger at times to try to support others, and an expression of humanity, of care for others when they are most at risk and suffering, has been incredible in terms of an expression of solidarity and love. So I'll leave it there, Charles. If there are more details, I'm happy to share those.
Yeah, thank you for this very heartwarming perspective that you've given us. And perhaps at the end, we'll come back to this if we do have a few moments. But I would like to go ahead and move to Director and Professor Pavlo Smytsnyuk. Professor Smytsnyuk, Russian President Vladimir Putin has quoted passages in the Bible to justify his war in Ukraine. The Russian Orthodox Church is a vital pillar in supporting Putin's war in Ukraine. Please take a few moments and speak to the intertwinement of religion and nationalism in the narratives of the Russian Orthodox Church, and address the questions of why the ROC supports this war, and or how the ROC used its narrative in Ukraine prior to the war through its proxy, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Director Smytsnyuk.
Yes, thank you, Charles. You see, historically, Russian Orthodox Church has been the biggest church in Russia, in Ukraine, in some other countries, Belarus, and they exercised an important influence on society in those countries, and sometimes even internationally. In Russia, because ROC became, in a way, a part of state symbolic attributes, or some describe it as a civil religion or even political religion of Russia. In Ukraine, religion enjoys a lot of respect and trust from population. People tend to trust churches more than they trust the president, the parliament, or judiciary. And that gave a margin of action to the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine as well. So I think first concept on which I would like to comment shortly is the so-called ideology of the Russian world, or Ruski Mir. And ROC understands itself as the church that covers many territories, many post-Soviet states, but as far as Japan. And in the past, they have conceptualized itself as a so-called cosmopolitan civilization, integrated Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, Moldovas. I looked at various declarations of Patriarch Kirill in 2009, 10, and onwards on this Russian Orthodox civilization. And there is a little bit of a game there. In Russian language, there are two words which translate into English as Russian. Российский, which refers to modern Russian civilization, and Ruski, which means the ancient Kievan Rus medieval state, which extended on Ukraine, European parts of Russia, Belarus, etc. So in 2009 and 10, Kirill was saying that the Russian world doesn't mean Российский, doesn't mean the world of Russian Federation. He said that it's not connected to the interest of one state only, it's not an instrument of political influence of the Russian Federation. That he even said that the fact that post-Soviet nation states have their own national sovereignty teaches us how to be respectful of differences, that he wants to exclude any paternalism of Russia playing the big brother, etc. But today the war became in a way apocalyptic. It revealed to us, apocalypse means to get rid of a whale. It revealed to us that behind this narrative, this cosmopolitan narrative, there was a clear political agenda. Yes, that the Russian Orthodox Church was working with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, with their military, and used its national presence in Russia to brainwash people, and its international links. First of all, in Eastern Europe, but also in other Western countries, to push its political agenda. And I think that you can speak at an academical level about, familiarity between different Eastern Slavic people of Byzantine tradition, as you can speak about, European identity between, Hungarians and Portuguese. However, when it becomes a political weapon, it becomes dangerous. But even if you look at it as a philosophical idea, this Russian world is a contradictory. It's built on a lie and inconsistency. It declares to be cosmopolitan, supranational, but in fact, it promotes political interests, diplomatical interests, etc. Putin speaks of the West and NATO as threatening to Russia. And you have Kirill, who condemns the West, the liberalism, the gay parades, etc. Although, frankly speaking, the Catholic position on LGBT is sometimes not very different from the Orthodox one, but we leave this to another discussion. And he also fails to see that NATO has a lot of majority Orthodox countries, nation states. Yes, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece are all NATO members and majority Orthodox. Putin challenges the right of Ukrainians to have a sovereign state. And Kirill says, oh, Ukrainians are not an independent nation. They are part of this big Russian nation. And even internationally, Putin and both Putin and ROC present Russia as a center for traditional values. And they go around the world to US, Europe, elsewhere to preach what Father Spadarov from Civiltà Cattolica has described as ecumenism of hate. And this goes as far as of Iran, with which Russian Orthodox Church has a dialogue on human rights, of all things. But at the end of the day, this ideology is inconsistent because it doesn't stay, even if we take the Russian Orthodox criteria for that. It's not a morally perfect society or church. Let me quote a priest of Russian Orthodox Church, Pavel Ostrovsky, who wrote 4 days ago a Telegram post where he said, I quote, "Some argue that Russia is a stronghold of everything bright and good, at enmity with the world's evil, satanism, and paganism. But this is all nonsense. How can a bright stronghold have 73% of divorces in families, where drunkenness with drug addiction is rampant, where theft and godlessness flourish? How many people will we see in a week in the churches of God at the Easter service?" Yes, Ostrovsky refers to the fact that Russia has one of the lowest church attendances rates in Europe. So this is not only violent, but like logically inconsistent ideology and intertwining between nationalism, nationalist or imperialist interests of the Russian state and the church. And a few words now on how this influence plays out in Ukraine, because one of two Orthodox churches in Ukraine belongs to Moscow Patriarchate, and they have been for at least a couple of decades channeling those ideas about Russian world, about anti-Westernism. They exaggerated the narratives of persecution, but the war became a huge shock for them. In the past, they always cherished their spiritual unity with Russian culture and Russian church. This war left them in the shock. With the Donbas war, they always refused to acknowledge Russian aggression, but today they don't have any more where to go. And their policy, their narrative has radically changed and is a big challenge for them. They still are part of Moscow Patriarchate, but we have more and more voices among clergy, bishops to leave the Patriarchate of Moscow. And we will see whether they will find enough courage, enough intellectual resources to find out their way of the impasse. And finally, as the only Ukrainian here on the panel, I would like just to thank to Notre Dame, to the Western academic milieu, to the churches in the West for their help and solidarity with Ukraine. It's very important for us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe you can respond to this question in about 30 seconds. This is for you, Professor Smytsnyuk. Patricia Lefevre asked, are criticisms of Patriarch Kirill having any effect on the ROC or the Patriarchate inside Russia? You could just maybe for about 30 seconds respond to that.
Orientalists are not known for being capable of short answers, but I'll try. I think yes and no. No, in the sense that the narrative of Patriarch Kirill doesn't change. The positive element of it that you have more and more priests and laity within the church that start seeing the problem with this war and condemn it. And this is very important for the future reconciliation that I hope one day will arrive between Ukrainians and Russians, not to blame the war on Russian nation as such, but to have a little bit of, you know, the seeds of brightness, of light among the Russian Orthodox Church members with whom to talk in the future.
Thank you. Well, certainly our thoughts and prayers are with the Ukrainian people as well as the good people of Russia who do not wish to be involved in this war. Panelists, this has been a much needed conversation. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. I wonder if before I give just a few concluding remarks here, if any of you have any final comment or thought you would like to share with us in about 1 minute.
If I may, a point of clarification, Annemarie, you mentioned the two Caritas organizations in Ukraine, and you mentioned the Roman Catholic and the Greek Orthodox. I assume you meant the Greek Catholic, not the Greek Orthodox.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor.
And second, we must understand the radically different nature of religious pluralism in both societies. Both are plural, but Russia is not pluralist because those religions are assigned to ethnic groups. So if you are a Russian Slavic, you are supposed to be a Russian Orthodox, whether you are in church or not. You are Russian Orthodox, and then you are Buddhist. So this is assigned by ethnicity. In Ukraine, they accept the principle of religious freedom. Individuals have the right to choose their religions. And so you have this pluralism, even within the same ethnic groups, you have a tremendous religious pluralism.
Well, I certainly hope this conversation contributes to a better understanding that religion plays in global affairs. Again, I want to thank the Nanovic Institute for European Studies, the Catholic Peace Building Network, and the University of Notre Dame's World Religions, World Church program for co-sponsoring this panel discussion. Jose, Robert, Annemarie, and Pavlo, thank you for the good work you are doing and for spending some time with us today. Additionally, I want to say thank you to Josh Stowe, who is our Senior Content Specialist, as well as Tim Checkley, who is with Information Technology here at Notre Dame, for making this program a success. On behalf of Mahan Mirza, the Executive Director, and all of us at the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion, thank you for joining us. Until next time, I'm Charles Powell. Goodbye.